Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, our guest is Dr. Clarissa Kristjansson, who's here all the way from Sweden, which I'm really excited about. She's an internationally recognized menopause educator and certified mindfulness practitioner. She's focused on the positive and transformative nature of life transition during the menopausal period. She is the host of the popular Thriving Through Menopause podcast and author of the bestsellers, The Mindful Menopause and The Potent Power of Menopause, a globally diverse perspective of feminine transformation. So that sounds quite awesome because a lot of the women that I work with are either pre-menopause or are in the transition already. And while we have people of all ages watching the show, but our little niche target area is women like us.
Women like us, yes.
Yeah.
We have experienced some issues, traumas before we even got to menopause, let alone in it.
Right. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because my audience, our listeners are women who are trauma survivors. So you and I have not talked about this beforehand, and so it may or may not be appropriate for me to ask. Please feel free sharing or not sharing what feels best. But if you're a trauma survivor and feel that's okay. Yeah. If it's not a dog or another pet interrupting podcast, it's children. So we all get that. So Clarissa, if it's okay to call you Clarissa, if there's any traumas in your personal life or professional life that you feel comfortable sharing with the audience, it just helps us connect a little more.
Absolutely. Well, and I talked about that in the second book where I shared my own story that I had a very traumatic childhood between the ages of 8 and 11, but obviously that had a big flow-on effect. My father was a very powerful member of the British judiciary who decided when I was about 7 or 8 that he didn't want to be married to my mother anymore. And on 3 separate occasions, he attempted to basically take her life. And that is, and it was done in a way that it was always seen as if she wasn't quite mentally well. Mm-hmm. And he would make small threats because at that stage he had met somebody else and he wanted to end the marriage, but he didn't because he was Catholic and very devout. And I'm not here to criticize people's religion, but he chose to then saw divorce as wrong. But if he could have my mother, out of the way or have her placed in a mental institution, then he could, of course, go on and do what he wanted to do. But the impact, of course, on you as a child is then that my mother's whole remit was to keep us safe. Now that creates a way of living that isn't really the most conducive to you being an adult that can have healthy relationships with your own self or with others. And really, I think that was the basis of a lot of the anxiety that resurfaced in my menopause, because we are going through, as myself as a neuroscientist and mindfulness practitioner would say, we're going through phenomenal changes with our brain. Mm-hmm. And that then was triggered me to then have extreme anxiety and a number of panic attacks. And I can now see, looking back and understanding so much more about trauma than I did, maybe even did at the time, how much that was related to what I had experienced as a child.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It sounds like I can appreciate that as a child you had a lot of anxiety flowing through you, like worrying about your mom. How does she fare? Has she passed on? Is she still alive?
She's passed on. She passed on about, and we're coming up close to 18 or 19 years ago. Okay. But really for my mom, I think, there were lots of underlying things. I mean, the order of the day, and, we're talking about 1970s UK, women's rights were very different than women's rights are today. My mother wasn't a British citizen, so she was living in the UK by, grace and favor rather than by right. Sweden wasn't a member of the European Union. And so a lot of what went on there was this continual pressure, and the pressure that she had in her life to be okay, to be safe, to work, to be independent. I mean, luckily she was a very well-educated person, but it was difficult. And she had a very, very traumatic menopause, with extreme migraines, which of course, she was gaslit by most clinicians. That's not unusual. I hate to say that. I'm sort of smirking about that, but I mean, that's, what happens. And that had ramifications that, I was 12 years old. I had to grow up very quickly. I had to step into an adult's role in my home, take care of my little sister, because my mother was essentially many times incapacitated and lay in bed, really coping with her migraines on the days she wasn't at work.
Right. Wow. So another example of, oftentimes when I have guests, they highlight examples of being what's called a parentified child. That's when you have to grow up so quickly. Yeah. So how did your childhood impact the work that you do now? Is there a correlation?
There is definitely a correlation. I work almost entirely with women who are going through, I think, a psychological issues connected to menopause. So I don't work so much with things like weight loss or exercise. That's not my area. But women who are really struggling with anxiety, panic, mild to moderate. So we're not talking clinical depression, which is a completely different space. Women who may be experiencing chronic pain that may have its roots in trauma. We can't always know that. And I am a trauma-informed mindfulness practitioner because I've done additional training and support for people in trauma, because some mindfulness practices are not necessarily appropriate for people who have trauma, or it can trigger their trauma.
And I know you may not have the numbers for this, but just an estimate or a ballpark. What would be your guess on the percentage of the women that you treat that are trauma survivors?
I'd say at least half of them are.
Okay.
In some way, there has been childhood trauma, there has been trauma brought on by illness, long-term illness, chronic pain, or trauma that has come because of toxic relationships. And a lot of that, then we go into menopause, we get heightened sensitivity, and these people often present as highly anxious, burning out, and an inability to cope. And for them, sometimes hormone replacement therapy works and sometimes it just doesn't.
I think your number might be a bit conservative.
Quite possibly. I would say probably 90% of people have experienced some form of trauma, but I think of the people who come to me, I think it's probably, it depends what we define trauma as.
Right.
How do we define it? Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. And so tell us a little more about what you do for women who are menopausal that seek out your services. What does treatment look like?
So what it looks like with me is that I work very much on the principles that I see connected to how mindfulness supports menopause. So we do a lot of work on stress reduction. It is clearly evidential that stress will heighten menopausal symptoms.
Yes.
Yeah. So we know that if you are already menopausal or you are struggling with stress, it's a chicken and egg situation there. You are likely to have issues with anxiety, panic, depression, mood irritability, brain fog, pain, and obviously considerable issues around insomnia and fatigue that isn't necessarily related to lack of sleep. So those are some of the areas that really fall into the broad remit of the work that I do, is working to overcome or be able to better, should I say, meet and manage the stresses in your life. But I do also do a lot of work on the direct psychological distress, as I call it, where I use mindfulness practices. And I also have a background in training, although I'm not a registered therapist, in cognitive behavioral therapy, ACT and compassion therapy, but I bring those together to work with people and tailor for them how they're going to meet and manage those difficult emotions and those, I don't like to call them symptoms, but experiences that emerge. And then finally, it's obviously about building better awareness, a health enhancement when we're more self-aware, when we're more able to embrace this time of life, then we experience also a greater sense of well-being. So work is also in that space of building deeper awareness of ourselves and what we're going through, and realizing that this is a life stage. It is not, the end of your life, but a great opportunity to review where you are and where you might like to go once this hormonal change is coming to an end, the big one, and you're stepping into a new space in life.
Right. So I have a question that's more out of curiosity. It feels like in movies and books, we read about women going through menopause and they're mourning womanhood, like not being able to conceive and birth children. And I know in my life, I'm not mourning that. And so I'm wondering, and I don't, I guess my friends are all over the place in terms of where they are in the cycle, but I'm not hearing that in my circle or in my therapy clients. So I wanted to know what your experiences are. Do women still mourn that, or is that myth? What's your experience?
I think it's obviously individual because we're all unique when it comes to this journey, but I don't think there are many women who have a family who are mourning the loss of being able to have more children. And I think we have to be careful about childless because a lot of people choose not to have a family. So for them, it's like, well, this is a choice I made. There are, of course, those women who may have not been able to conceive, who may have not have had a success with IVF. For them, this really does mark the end. And for them, there can be grief and mourning. I think women can experience a certain amount of grief at this time, but that can be as much related to the fact that our children are growing up and we are changing our relationship with them at the time that we're undergoing such a big personal, psychosocial, biological change. But I think you're right. This is not front and center that we're mourning that we can't have loads more children. I think that's possibly a myth that's put out there.
Okay, just checking. Otherwise, I'm a little abnormal here. Yeah, I'm really glad you framed it in that context of the biopsychosocial, and I would probably add spiritual transition for women. I think that's really important for people to keep in mind, because when we go through changes, it does impact all areas of our life. Yeah. Can you say a little more about that?
Definitely. I think in the menopause world, if you were and your listeners are listening to this, a lot of the conversation is about the biological, hormones this, hormones that. Right. But we are changing fundamentally, as I've said, in the brain. Our brains go all a little bit fuzzy in that. But when we come through this menopause years, and they do end, sometimes they don't feel like they're ending, but they do end, then we actually find that our brains are quite structurally different. So the psychological is that we drop a lot of our multitasking, we become clearer thinking, we have much more capacity to regulate our emotions. And naturally that flows through to being far less anxious, a little bit more chilled about life. So the psychological, the time in the middle is very messy at times, but the journey outward is very, very interesting and very positive. Socially, I think the whole contextual element of becoming an older woman in a society that is obsessed with youth is the bigger challenge. And even though we are seeing, older, more powerful women, celebrities going through, the dominant narrative is young is good, old is best invisible, and put a little to the side, particularly if you are female. And so I think coming to terms with the new relationship where maybe your job opportunities aren't what they once were, maybe you're being dismissed. I mean, we're already dismissed a lot of the time when we meet our doctors, or we get ignored in a shop. Things we haven't noticed before can happen to us. And it's about how we embrace this time of life and create it for ourselves, and create a new persona. And if they ignore me in the shop, well, then I'm going to do what I want, kind of thing, But I do think for some women, that is quite a jarring, different narrative, particularly when you're hearing all the time, stay young, stay young, stay young, the Botox, the fillers. Just today, there was an article from some clinician who said, oh, we can hold back time and you can be young forever. I mean, that is not a helpful type of public debate for most women in this time of, and that's what we're also then learning to embrace anew us if we've been a different person, or we're being told we're not good enough.
Right. Yeah. However, I did hear some hope at the beginning of your description of our future post-menopause. I really liked what you said about clarity of thinking. And I know there's no exact ages, but is there an age range?
Look, I think if we said what's common, I think we recognize more and more that women are going into this menopausal phase somewhere in their early to mid 40s. I think it's much, much younger than we've recognized. This is when we're feeling particularly the roller coaster of progesterone, a very important hormone, that drops like a stone. And that's often what's setting off our mental issues, where we feel sensitive, emotional, less able to manage stress. And that can go on till our early 50s. So we can spend, typically anywhere between 5 to 10 years in this total phase. The common age that is cited is 51, but there are people who are still really not finished with this stage of life in their mid 50s, but it's somewhere in that sort of mid 40s to mid 50s time span that we are experiencing this change. And that's the time when we have the biggest responsibilities often in our life on many different levels. And I think that's what is making this conversation so much more elevated, because really women are the first generation who are dialing up their presence in the workplace, whatever level they are on the work ladder. And we are more likely to be single mothers, huge financial burden. And we do 75% of caring of home-related, caring-related duties for our parents, for our children, for our families. We're overloaded.
Yes. And thus, if women remarry, it's really important to be careful on the mate you select. I'm saying that because my husband is very active and involved in our kids and at home. Otherwise, I'd probably be really cuckoo during this menopausal phase.
It's true. And it is really important that we are really well supported, and that the conversation about menopause at work as an important conversation is important. I mean, women are important at work, and having trauma-sensitive, informed workplaces is critical. But at least I see that the conversation might open at menopause, which is not a bad place to open, about our needs, because we are standing on two stools and coping with so much.
That was so helpful. Yeah. So other than your own books, which I am going to add to my reading list, I would love to have said I've read them already, but my podcast I booked up so quickly. I don't know how it happened. And I was like, all of a sudden I didn't have time to read all of the books I want to read. Are there other books that you feel have been really helpful to you as you do your work, or even they don't have to be about menopause, but any other books that have really been inspirational or helpful to you?
Well, I think a couple have been. One has been The Upgrade and The Female Brain, both of those by Dr. Luann Brizendine. She is a wonderful women's psychiatrist. And I've learned a lot by reading her books. And I also love The Wild Feminine by Tammy Lynn, and I'm not sure what her surname is, but I love her book, which is really all about the root of our body, our wombs, our pelvis, and how really healing that, which is a huge connection to women's trauma, can also be incredibly releasing of this powerful woman that gets locked and can't show her face to the world.
So the second book was called Wild Feminine?
Wild Feminine, yes.
And the first one was called?
The other two books are called The Upgrade and The Female Brain.
Okay, yeah, The Female Brain I've read. Upgrade I have not. Is it the same author for both?
Same authors, both Luann Brizendine, and The Upgrade came out earlier this year.
Oh, yeah. Well, I need to upgrade my reading list.
Thank you for that. Hope. There's a lot of hope there for the future of women as we age.
Very good. Yeah. So as you know, a lot of times in this phase of life and others, women can get kind of stuck, stuck in limiting beliefs, stuck in maybe not feeling hope for their future. What kind of wisdom would you say to that person who's really struggling out there?
I think one of the biggest things that I believe in is self-compassion. And really practicing self-compassion can unlock so much of this stuckness. I love the concept from Professor Paul Gilbert about becoming a compassionate self. And much of his work, and obviously he's the founder of compassion-focused therapy, is absolutely built on this concept that we can become a compassionate self by really exploring the language we use, by practicing compassion on a daily basis. And I integrate a lot of his learning into parts of the work that I do in helping people to really come to that recognition of how do I feel about myself? How do I speak to myself? How do I shift that? And I love those sort of exercises of the two stools where you sit on one stool and you speak to your stuck critical self, and then you swap chairs and you speak to yourself in a different voice. It's very illuminating and very powerful, and can bring up a lot of deep emotion of just how much we've allowed ourselves to be boxed in to a difficult space, and how much when we shift language and behavior, we can make huge changes to ourselves and do it gently. We don't have to, rush through some program. We can work through this on a daily basis, small pieces of compassion every day.
I like that, like the baby steps. Yeah. I also like Dr. Kristin Neff's book on self-compassion.
Absolutely. Mindful self-compassion. Christopher Germer, who is Kristin's partner, he wrote a wonderful book called The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. I read that book during my menopause when I was going through my crisis. And I can absolutely say that reading one small chapter or sub-chapter every day was transformational for me. It's filled with simple wisdom and beautiful practices.
Oh, thank you for that tip. Yeah. I'll have to add all those to the show notes. Yeah. So Clarissa, we are so happy that you are here today to share your wisdom. Any women who would like to know more about you or even possibly work with you, how would they best reach you?
The best way to reach me is to go to my website, which is my name, ClarissaKristjansson.com. So if you can spell my name, it's reasonably easy, and you can connect with me there, because that's where, if you send me an email from there, or you can look at the sort of work that I do And it's not prescriptive, it's an example. And I think the thing to do is to look at that, see, does that kind of resonate with me, and then connect, because we can always have a conversation.
All right. Well, again, I am so appreciative that you are here. Menopause is not talked about enough. So I'm appreciative. All right. Well, thank you, Karen.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.